Throughout human history, some of our greatest steps and progresses, like the civil rights movement, were always preceded in parliament, in the judiciary rather, by top-down change rather than by direct vote in parliament. And we think that this is the right way to push ahead progressive social change. What do we mean when we discuss such change? We're talking about liberal social movements that gradually support equality or representation for marginalized groups. So in the modern world, we're talking about movements for marriage equality or minority representation. How is change implemented by the judiciary? It is done through individuals bringing up claims and class action lawsuits to civil and constitutional courts. The courts can mandate institutional changes that are binding and often immediately effective. For example, the payment of damages or institutional change and reform. This is contrasted against parliamentary majority, which involves the passage of legislation through a deliberative process in an elected body, which is often cumbersome and weak. What is our stance? First of all, we think that we're talking about the significant and pressing social change that's required in the world today. Even in situations where there is majority support for progress, we argue that courts are still ultimately more efficient at enacting this progress and changing social attitudes than parliaments. We're going to forward four main arguments. First, that courts are a legitimate instrument for progressive social change. Second of all, that they are effective at immediately enacting these reforms. Third, that they enfranchise support from society. And seventh is going to talk to you in extension about creating lasting changes in mindsets. First of all, the courts are a legitimate instrument to push through social change. Why do we have courts? They are intended to cover for situations where elected representatives often fail the people. That's why constitutional courts, for example, can judge on issues of the Constitution and what is right. Unit courts are nominally impartial bodies intended to interpret this Constitution and cover for potential failings of the legislature. And of course, the reason why we have a Constitution is to have a check and balance to protect the minorities from unjust exploitation by the legislature and the executive. So we think that crucially, courts are in a position and are endowed with the ability to interpret this Constitution and decide when it applies. Therefore, social change passed through the courts and ruled by the courts is legitimate in the case and due to the fact that they ruled it based on the Constitution, which we treat as a representative of social values. Therefore, we think that they have the ability to adjudicate social arrangements and decide which forms of social change are best and what kind of reforms are best placed to address social change. Furthermore, we put here that courts are also more likely to subject to checks and balances, such as appeal, for example, if initial checks and balances are insufficient within the court process itself. Therefore, because we think that courts are fundamentally placed to judge the Constitution, which is a fundamental embodiment of social values, we think that the kinds of social change they enact are legitimate. Let's move on to a more important matter. Why are they effective at ultimately enacting this change? Let's point out that a priority in top-down social change is its immediacy. The problem with many progressive social movements today is that they seek redress against abuse, which is rampant and threatens the fundamental liberties of those involved. Yes?
What happens when courts, in some cases, overturn popular legislation, such as, for instance, Citizens United, the overturning or the weakening of the McCabe?
We think that if popular legislation flies in the face of minority rights and tramples on the ability of minorities to live dignified lives in accordance with the Constitution, then it's perfectly right for courts to interpret the Constitution in such a way that obviates these changes. So we think that often, current problems facing minorities are fundamental to their rights, like, for example, marriage discrimination or unfair employment practices. And crucially, because these infringements are so foundational, change needs to be implemented immediately. What is the problem with parliaments? They are far too slow to enact this change in a meaningful manner. Why? Because parliaments are subject to things like political bargaining, particularly due to the nuanced nature of many social issues involved, like marriage equality, we think that parties hold trade favors and will often debate issues to a standstill with filibusters. So we think that they're systemically inefficient and inclined not to pass these social changes fast enough to protect minorities whose fundamental rights are being threatened. Secondly, we think that, no thank you, often parliaments and elected bodies are subject to presidential vetoes and checks by multiple channels. For example, in the USA, the president exercises an executive veto, and the House of Representatives and the Senate have the ability to lock each other in deadlock if they disagree. Moreover, we think that parliaments are often hampered, and the ability of social change to pass through parliaments is often hampered by the huge campaigning and bartering process, where often it is important to canvass for politicians to support a particular form of social change. So we think that all these reasons make Parliament systemically inefficient in enacting social change immediately. Courts are less encumbered and therefore more efficient because they don't have the same problems of bureaucracy. And we see a track record of success in courts immediately striking down unjust laws or creating institutional change, like for example how they struck down the Defense of Marriage Act in the USA in 2010, within several months of the case being brought up. So we think that is a critical step in marriage equality. Moreover, we think that the immediate recognition of rights is far more important than gaining some kind of wider social recognition in the short term. Because we think that the rights being threatened are so fundamental and instrumental of a person's self-actualization that they have to be implemented and they have to be protected straight away. Let's look at a number of other case studies of this. In the 1990s, Mandela rapidly used the courts to repeal apartheid laws throughout South Africa. We think that the rapidity and the pace of this change would not have been achieved if it had been passed through the South African Parliament and throughout all the campaigning and bartering processes. So we think that courts are systemically better at engendering change immediately. Last of all, that they help create lasting social change and change mindsets. We think that top-down institutional change is necessary for public acceptance and enfranchisement on progressive social issues. Let's look at the context of many social movements today. We face an apathetic majority that is currently ambivalent to solid and concerted efforts at change. They face a vocal minority which often blocks critical legislation from passing through Parliament, like for example, with regard to marriage equality. For the moderate majority, we think that prejudices and subtle norms and ways of thinking that are discriminatory to minorities are often reinforced by institutions and the way individuals and institutions interact. We think that, therefore, courts can create and can enact lasting changes in institutions and state structures, like for example, our Australian courts or the immediate reparations for native Australian Aborigines under Kevin Rudd. We think that these kinds of changes were immediate institutional, therefore changing social norms and changing the mindsets of the moderate majority. Moreover, we put to you that the court case also provides brilliant opportunities for the creation of narratives, right? Where individuals who are oppressed by the state and who feel small in comparison to the state can show themselves standing up to their oppressors and can show themselves and can portray this in the future as a powerful narrative of success. So because we engender lasting change for minorities and because we create change immediately, we are very proud to stand in government.
Thank you. To present the clash of the opposition, I'd like to invite the leader of the hearing.
The problem with any judicial decision is an undemocratic top-down way of doing anything doesn't actually garner any public buy-in. And the problem really applies to social issues because contentious social issues are wrangles that are very emotive in nature. They are very concerned with personal convictions of individuals within your community. Therefore, when it comes to these issues, people don't take well to other people's convictions being imposed upon them without a process of coming around to understand it or believe in it. I'm going to cover 3 points for you today, and then I will melt their rebuttals into my substantive. Firstly, I'm going to look at why you need a bottom-up approach towards getting buy-in for social issues. Secondly, I'm going to look at why it is ineffective to create social change or lasting social change through judiciary. Thirdly, I'll give you the comparison or why a more democratic means of parliamentary debate and passing bills is so much better. So firstly, on why we believe that a bottom-up approach is so much better. We think that top-down approaches like what they have proposed simply don't work because people need to believe the messages being sent out by the courts and the laws. They can write to us about how minorities are suffering and so on, and how liberal views are so important. Personally, I like the liberal point of view. I like things like pro-choice rules, gay rights, trans-sex change from a young age. But the issue is what I stand for may not be what my larger community or what many other people stand for. We have to accept basically, right, that outside of the debate circuit, the social issues are very contentious issues, and it's often not our place to decide for people. And even if this is right, they're not going to believe you anyway. Realize really how divisive these issues are. Realize how different and absolute people may see the world from you. Realize that for a lot of people, their views are very colored by personal discomfort, by fear and by the quantity of numbers backing them out. And realize that being liberal also exists on a very great spectrum, right? Where you may agree with some liberal social changes, but you may not with others, even if you are oppressed minority. We therefore think that going about changing people's minds cannot happen through a single change in the law. Of course, we believe that people can be persuaded, people can change their minds eventually. But how? And that is a big question. We realize that it has to be first gradual and organic. There's a reason why people who are now LGBT allies started by knowing LGBT as friends and therefore overcame their own fear and prejudices. People also need to take ownership on liberal ideas to reconcile with their own beliefs and stand in opposition to it, or with things like doctrinal authorities, and therefore create their own paradigm shift they can really believe it as their own belief. We also believe that the community as a whole must shift, right? There must be a slow movement of, say, your anti-trans groups towards being more liberal through things like dialogue. Because if the community is fine it, you yourself will therefore start to believe that it's the right way to go. Here's the only way to create a lasting social change that they have already put down as their end goal. That brings you on then to look at how this lasting social change and belief is not created through any judicial decision. Why do we say so? We realize that firstly, the end goal of the government is formal procedural change immediately. We ask you two questions. One, why is a procedural change greater or more or better than representative change? And also, why is speed so very important to you? We also have two results, right? Firstly, like user, we realize that for any judicial decision to be effective, you need buy-in from bureaucrats as well. We don't think they've shown us how they're going to ensure that. Furthermore, what really happens when courts overturn popular legislation? Something that Michael has brought up. We talk about hobby lobby, I don't think you understand what it is. It's when the courts decided that corporations could actually discriminate against minorities, something that is not pro-liberal social views at all. So you realize that when you give courts this power and legitimacy, right? The flip side, basically regression can happen as well. I'm going to go a bit further and show you why having your judges decide everything is not going to work. In a moment, sir, realize that when judges speak for everybody, it's highly unconvincing in nature. Why? Because all the justifications are grounded in legal judgments, in things like the reading or interpretation of the Constitution, things like legal precedent. We don't need a justification that people really understand or buy because it's basically drowned in legal jargon. Before I go on, yes.
Brown v. Board of Education was crucial in the civil rights movement for kick-starting public buy-in. Why would you leave this to the Parliament, which would simply reject any law to support the civil rights movement?
I'm going to show you in a bit, right, why the Parliament doesn't always result in things like blockages. But instead, yes, I agree that it's a trade-off in terms of speed. I'll cover that later. But I think the slowness is basically necessary as people slowly turn around to ideas and slowly learn why it's so important to embrace these ideas. But more of that in my third argument. Let me move on. I've already shown you how legal judgments are not very convincing, right? But what then happens? We find that it's very inflammatory to conservative groups, the people we need to convince the most, right? Why? Because the law of society is a language of code to govern everybody in a society. But now people are going to feel that this communal code stands against that. We therefore see that it's more likely to have a backlash towards the socially progressive movements. We realize therefore it's easier for your conservative movements to come out and say, look, there are things like gay agendas, liberal agendas against us. There's self-inflammatory rhetoric therefore in place. You create us versus them mentality towards oppressed groups, allowing oppressed groups to play allowing conservative groups to play the victim card, creating things like your men's rights movements and so on. We also realize that any judgment is not an impartial thing they claim to be. Any activist judgment is a judge's interpretation. Therefore, the problem is that you're going interpretation for interpretation. Liberal bias versus conservative bias, while allowing the liberal bias to have greater hold and greater power than other and closing all dialogues. That's how you ensure there is no buy-in, no compromise from the very start. Let's then move on to my third point on why democratic policy of being more democratic is so much better. We realize the Parliament is social democratic because you have debates, because you have voting on multiple bills. It's not a delay or a deadlock like they say. Instead, allowing views to be completely represented. The rest of the discussion that takes place is therefore, firstly, transparent. Because the public can see every detail that is going on. Secondly, it's accessible because you're not using legal jargon that the public does not understand. Thirdly, it's applicable because politicians always ground discussion in what real implication it has for society at large. Furthermore, meaning that filibustering and trading favors, there is a natural check on it because politicians have to consider the ground sentiment. They have to be re-elected, so they won't deviate starkly from what people want. And they will go about getting public education in place, right? Through things like movements and allyship and awareness raising and dialogues, therefore changing people's minds for them to push for things. Furthermore, we think that trading favors are not always a bad thing. It's always good as compromise in place, so the whole society really believes in the sort of change you are going for. Lastly, I want to go us is a trade-off of moments. But it's important for you to take things slowly because you need a buy-in in the larger community. What really is a legal procedure of marriage? If your family disowns you, if they see Westboro pickets at your wedding, if your pastor refuses to marry the two of you, if restaurants don't sit your family, and these attitudes are hard on when perceived as something acting against them. This is really important in conservative communities. They're very communal in nature, and family sentiments matter a lot to individuals. Therefore, we really believe, right, that when real acceptance in society, a procedure is not enough. You need all that buy-in, and that takes time. For all these reasons, I'm actually proud to oppose.
Thank you. BBM, please.
Government today is very, very proud to stand by a history of humanity's greatest milestones. The triumph of universal suffrage in the streets of Selma and the corridors of Washington. The abolishment of apartheid in the markets of Johannesburg. The creation of reservations and recognition for the First Nations and their people in the icy wilderness of Nova Scotia. All of this could never have happened because of democratic vote or majority sentiment, but because of judicial systems and courts that stood by for what they felt was right. Was there immediate public buy-in? No. Lots of white Americans hated the fact there were black Americans in their schools and black soldiers in their army. But we proudly stand by the fact that Brown's Board of Education put a black man with a white student in the same classroom? Yes, we are. Two questions. Firstly, what is the role of the state? And secondly, on political buy-in. First question, what is the role of the state? And the implicit fundamental assumption of their entire case is that they stand by a laissez-faire approach of governments, where governments can only impose something through democratic majority. Let's be clear, the last time we let the majority vote decide the relative worth of human beings, 30 million African Americans were enslaved in cotton plantations across the American South. So no, we're not going to repeat the same mistake once again. But states can often forward social aims. In fact, we proudly stand by a model where courts are social instrumentation to forward a beneficial social aim. In the same way, governments stand by redistributive taxation, even though lots of people hate the fact they have to pay taxes. Popularity is not a prerequisite for governments to pass things. Governments have far greater foresight than the individual on the ground, who is often constrained by the incentives of a single person. That's why governments are given a lot more power, for instance, a monopoly over coercive power in the military and the police forces, to establish what they feel is socially just. More importantly, we disagree that all judges do is talk in legal jargon. In many cases, Supreme Court judges make very moral judgments as well. They talk about what they feel is morally right. They talk about the aspirations the state should move towards. So no, don't tell us about how people won't buy into this. No thanks. Why is speed important? They ask a fundamental question. Because people are continually being oppressed. For every year you delay a social movement, for every 4 years you delay, pre-1960s, another generation of women lose their voice in the political system in America. So that's why we don't think parliamentary or congressional vote is an effective mechanism to help people. But here they also talked about, well, we believe we should respect the views of everyone in democracy. No, in fact, today, governments are perfectly fine no platforming racist political parties or xenophobic parties, even though we recognize they have some legitimate views. The very fact that they cut out and they're exclusionary within the grander scheme of things means that governments can intervene to stand by for a far greater aspiration, a far greater majority of the state. Second question, on political buy-in. We're going to deal with this argument in greater depth in my substantive case. But suffice to say for now, yes, political buy-in may be short-handed in the short term, but we believe we do what's best to spark discourse, to expand the limits of acceptable discourse within society so people and their consciousness begin to broach different topics they couldn't have in the past. Let's talk about that more in my argument now. Our final argument from this side is that we engender sustainable change. Changes enshrined in legal documentations and constitutions through the mechanism of courts are better at valuing support. Before I move on, yes ma'am.
Just because you believe that pro-choice is important, it's not enough to show why you should override the legit concerns of pro-life versus blackout. There's a better reason why your view matters more.
Yes, because we think it's fair if governments say that women deserve the right to decide whether they're going to have a child. Some things are morally subjective judgments that we believe governments should have a decision to make. Because sometimes people clearly make the wrong decisions, as in the case of race in the past. Back to our side's arguments. This means that the support of communities is only ensured when we can promise them a long-term sustainable movement that parliaments and congresses cannot achieve. Why is this the case on our side? Because the judicial system has access to invoke constitutional changes, parliaments do not. Why? First of all, there are often prohibitively high legal barriers for parliamentarians to amend constitutions. I mean, legally, parliaments can't amend constitutions to the same extent that courts can. Secondly, more importantly, there's a high turnover rate of politicians. Different political parties come and go. The political nature of a parliament or a congress often means that changes in the society is not long-lived. Sure, judges may be political sometimes as well, but these are affiliations that are not systemic to courts. But political affiliations are always there in a parliament. They're always there in a congress. Turnover rates means anything that is passed cannot be guaranteed to remain there in the next decade or the next 2 decades as well. Why is it bad that parliaments cannot change constitutions in the long run? First of all, a lot of problems are deeply ingrained in the national conception. For instance, nobody dared to challenge apartheid because for the greater part of a century, apartheid was taken to be the norm in South Africa. People wouldn't dare challenge something that's enshrined in the constitution as a basic conception of the South African state by the Africans and the Dutch colonists in the past. Secondly, there's a low commitment to social movements due to changing of political power. For example, in Greece, in the past, the Pan-Hellenic Socialist League provided welfare support for ethnic minorities. But this all changed when Syriza, the next party, came into power, only curtailing equal representation, even thinking of disallowing them to vote. Clearly, social movements can't exist when political parties change so rapidly in the modern day. In France, when Sarkozy promised equal rights for all religions and all ethnicities, this was undermined when the Socialist Party came into power and banned the burqa. People can't trust parliaments to stick to what they promised in the past, even if this means transcendental universal human rights are lost. We allow governments to reduce crucial social milestones on their side to nothing more than the whims and fancies of individual governments at that point in time. Moreover, there isn't any legal precedent for parliaments to do this. So that's why people don't buy into the kind of movements they talk about. There's even less buy-in on their side. How do we solve this problem? First of all, courts challenge the boundaries of acceptability. Think about it. In 1960s America, no one would have dared challenge the fact that African Americans were only half of that of a white American, because that was the fundamental part of the conception of the United States of America. That was the core of the American identity. Yet courts, for instance, courts that pioneered the civil rights movement were the ones that expanded the Constitution. They expanded the range of discourse that people were allowed to have in society, so that we push the issue of a post-racial society back to the forefront of public consciousness. That's how we spark public discourse. That's how in the long run, we create public mind to the kind of policies that we stand for on our side. But secondly, courts are also a fantastic mechanism to create legal precedents. Courts, for instance, can establish precedents that in the future will create a long-run change to even more social benefits. That's exactly the kind of long-run benefits that people can rally behind. People know that the benefits a court established in society will last for decades to come, not something like the whims and fancies of a parliament or a congress. Consequently, for all these reasons, we are very proud to stand on such proposition.
Thank you. DLO, please.
We think that the discussion about Roe v. Wade, Brown versus Board of Education, while we would really like that, we think the long discussion about naming one example or the other can simply be matched as well with Hobby Lobby, Citizens United, many other cases like that. So we don't think that this really is a debate about we stand for Roe v. Wade. We don't think this is a debate in which obviously we come up with like, no, we are anti-abortion rights. We think there's a broader debate that they've never come down to. The broader principle, what the perception is when courts, basically, their argument is that it is more legitimate, meaning the body abortion, that it is better implemented by courts, right? Not necessarily just whether it's more legitimate, but it's better implemented by courts. Why? Because we necessarily that maybe more people, maybe it changes people's mindsets more and therefore create some sort of outcome. So let's talk about the broad principles rather than just simply spouting out examples because we think that creates a wash. So let's ask a few questions before I go to my argument about how we won't trust in the judicial system and why it's bad, especially for nascent democracies. Firstly, do courts make just change? Secondly, do courts make speedy change? Thirdly, do courts make lasting change? Let's do the first one, because what they come up here and they kind of said, look, minority rights, the majority may not always be right, right? Therefore, Parliament presumably may make bad decisions. So courts need to come in and be saviors to minorities, such as women, never mind. Minorities, like racial minorities, like First Nations and so forth, the gay rights movement. Firstly, we think there's a fundamental assumption on their side. They've never ever defended. They've never truly explained. They've assumed that there is some justice, there's this overarching, clear, very self-evident justice or just decision to be made. We don't necessarily think that there is one clear idea of what progressive change is and how that's manifested, how it's implemented, and who makes the decision on that. They've never made that argument. Why? Because we see lots of division around what exactly is progressive change. Even amongst, for instance, the gay rights movement, where there's division about whether there ought to be marriage equality. Right? There's also division, for instance, amongst women about whether we want progressive social change by having, for instance, quotas for women in university. We think there's division even within minority groups, let alone broader society. But furthermore, if it is that self-evident, according as DPM likes presenting it as such, we believe all women should have suffrage, of course we like all women have suffrage, it's fine. But if it's that self-evident, then let society come to it. Then we think that if it's that self-evident, then we can decide. But the fact that society hasn't decided, and yes, society may be with it, and yes, that's something we regret. It does not necessarily mean we therefore run roughshod over it. There's something they've never explained. Why there is this immutable good that we all know that somehow this select group of 5 or maybe 12 judges somehow miraculously knows above and beyond elected parliamentarians, which presumably just have a greater critical mass, who represent the majority of the people and are concerned about the interests of the people. And secondly, in this case, then of course they argue that courts are not politicized. So therefore, that's a good thing. Firstly, let's understand this. Let's not use the term politicized as if it's some sort of like evil disease. We think that the idea that you are concerned about democracy and representing the interests of people shouldn't be treated as if it was something dirty, right? We think that if you're politicized, we think courts, if the role of politics is dirty, then we think politicians are similarly, judges are as much dirty as politicians, right? Given that, for instance, judges sometimes get elected in certain jurisdictions, or they get appointed by politicians themselves, horrors of horrors, right? Furthermore, then they go, even if they are politicized, they'll just have to, no, it's not true. For instance, most Supreme judges hold their positions for their whole life. The problem then is, if anything, they are far less responsive to social change. If you have been appointed, for instance, right? Like, for instance, Clarence Thomas being appointed so long ago is pretty much just a dinosaur, right? Has obviously not progressed with the time because he was appointed in a time when he was conservative and he was appointed by a conservative leader. We think if you truly become more, for instance, more liberal in the US, then necessarily the courts will represent that change, even though Parliament itself does. Then let's deal with the second question. Do courts make speedy change? This one we've dealt with very clearly, very easily, right? Speed is not the key for everything. I think it's important that we do have discussion, discourse, and buy-in. Why? Because sometimes you can speedily, for instance, make wrong decisions, since there is no clearly self-evident good. Clear right decision. But furthermore as well, we don't think that therefore it links to the last point about whether you make lasting change and whether it's a stable change. Because they've simply gone, look, it's binding, and somehow it becomes law as this like glorious thing. Parliament also make laws, to be honest. But we think moreover, we do think that laws do change and courts do overturn their own decisions, right? We think, for instance, the fact that previously even the idea of progressive social change shows that courts themselves can, yes, they may move forward on their previous position, can also move back. That's why we've seen, for instance, things like Citizens United, where previously there were rules about, about, for instance, corporations funding, even though supported by the Supreme Court, and then later the Supreme Court backpedaled. They've never shown us why they can move forward. We should not be cautious about them moving back. We think that's the problem on their side. What they do is they open the gates for, yes, progressive social movement. But they also open the floodgates for progressive social movement. We think that's particularly bad. Since we're talking about a small group, but with no checks and balances in this particular case, we think that's the problem they need to deal with. But moreover, what we also think more importantly is they're not necessarily going to implement in active change. We see this, for instance, the case of the activist judicial court, the Supreme Court in India, where they decided, for instance, that, as progressive social change, we need to decide that every child has a right to a certain number of calories. But because they are non-experts, because they aren't, for instance, have their ear to the ground with bureaucrats, as politicians often do, right? Because cabinet, for instance, is drawn, cabinet is drawn from Parliament itself. We think in that particular situation, what you end up with is that you end up often with rulings that you can't actually implement, which undermines the effectiveness that they came from. Furthermore, what we think is particularly problematic in places like India, where there is a long-lasting distrust of being told what you ought to believe in because of
colonialism because, for instance, of dictatorships, things like Suharto in Indonesia or Marcos in the Philippines. We think, especially in nascent democracies, where there is that great distrust, what we now have is we may now have a group of 5 or maybe 13 judges. These ivory tower, highly educated, sort of presumably under that paradise, to say what? Social change, liberal, right? Versus a very, very conservative majority in society. What we think in this particular situation is you will be seen as being the ivory tower, shoving your decision down people's throat. Why is that bad? Because in a situation where people have to trust the courts, where they have to trust that there is an impartial justice that is not colored by your value system, right? Where you are interpreting the law that is supposed to represent the people. The Constitution is supposed to be the soul of the people, representing the interests of the people. You think what that does is push people away. That's why, for instance, we now see Muslims, for instance, moving away from secular courts to informal Sharia tribunals in places like Europe. You think that's particularly harmful when people end up not trusting a fundamental part of the democratic system because they have distrusted another fundamental part of the democratic system.
Thank you. To summarize the debate for the Gov, I'd like to invite the government witness. Here.
Two very broad questions. One, let's talk about the process of the change that's going to involve. And two, let's talk a little bit about the sustainability of the change in the long term. First, the process of the change. The largest contention that is coming out from opposition is that we need to look at a larger set, a spectrum of liberal values that represents a democracy. We pointed out very clearly in second, but no clear response from them, that popularity is never a prerequisite by which we judge policy. So taxation, for instance, is a terribly unpopular, say, policy, but we still have it because the government can determine that there is a wider social good. They claim we believe all these policies are self-evident in their benefit. No, that's not what we claim. Let's make it very clear to you what government stands for. Our case is not about choosing between two popular or two unpopular policies. It is about deciding what is constitutionally acceptable. So no, we do not have to make a value judgment that this popular policy or this unpopular policy is better than another. We simply need to make a judgment through the legal system that this is constitutionally acceptable. So we do not need to support a specific iteration of gay rights or marriage equality. Or what we can support is that the Constitution allows for gays to marry. So what we're determining is constitutional boundaries rather than individual popular policy. Recognizing this and placing this in clarity, opposition that needs to reframe their case to directly clash with the large mechanisms that we brought from first. But let's deal with their case anyway. They said from first, they'll play the victim card, that there will be siege mentality. Let us face it, they will always play the victim card. If we're talking about people from the Westboro Baptist Church, you cannot expect that to change overnight, since that was the example they used in first. But then we tell you, it is worse on their side. Because on the victim card is played in situations where they believe whatever popular policy is enacted is representative of the people. These conservatives are going to say, I'm a large part of the populace. I'm a important part of the populace. So then even why am I not represented within this policy? This is different rather from constitutional boundaries which we're allowed to accept. Because it merely means that it is a possibility by which possible future policies can come in play. Well, thank you, madam. So when we redefine constitutional boundaries, we mean that the victim card is far as played on our side. And then they say, oh, elected justices don't change. So this creates a stoic nature within law. Well, first, they do change. We don't think that they simply come in conservatives and therefore will remain or in the same status quo as they began in the first place. Even if we admit that their ideologies will change, so say they remain a conservative, they still put unique perspectives on the areas that are uniquely important to today. So the relevance still remains. We don't believe that this is a large point at all. We don't believe that there is a loss of their case. But really, a lot of this debate hinges on the idea of efficiency. And here's why. For the first speaker, we gave you systemic reasons why efficiency was important. Their failure to do with this was problematic because it hinged and it killed out a lot of the case the opposition brought up. Here are two primary reasons why efficiency is important. One, that we remove discrimination in the here and now, especially when discrimination is thriving, when people are suffering on the basis of a lack of legal changes, the lack of a social change. We remove this discrimination with immediacy, especially if they want to debate in the context of nascent democracies where minorities are still being killed, still being discriminated within the legal system. We think this change is efficient. But here's where we clinch this argument and break the deadlock. sometimes we just cannot wait. Sometimes even if we're willing to admit that discrimination can be solved in the long term, we cannot wait for later to create the change because the change will not come. Sometimes it is important to ride the wave of what is currently gaining momentum. That's why the example of ground V1 education was so important, because it is a clear example of when certain policies or certain ideologies gain momentum in society. Maybe not enough to change political mindset in the short term, but this momentum was capitalized by a legal suit, which eventually resulted in constitutional changes. This momentum will otherwise be lost on their side, because they are willing to adopt slowness in exchange for efficiency. Ultimately, efficiency is important because we remove discrimination and we ride the wave and the momentum that is important to keep these social changes going. We take the idea of the process of this change. Let's talk about sustainability of the change. And here's where about in that case, without the idea of public buy-in. Well, we accept that public buy-in is important, but what we claim it first already, and no response to their side, is that you need a jolt on a constitutional level to recognize public buy-in. What was the analysis? It was very clear analysis from first, is that social norms can be changed through institutions. We often inform ourselves of what we believe in through the institutions that we buy into. So when courts can make massive changes to these institutions on a legal and constitutional level, you create widespread change in terms of public buy-in as well. The remaining analysis then was about nascent democracies. That's where we told you already that rights are important with immediacy when it comes to nascent democracies. They told us about, Muslims are turning to Sharia courts. Let us remind you that the reason many of these Muslims are turning to Sharia courts is because they feel disenfranchised by parliamentary policy rather than by the legal system. So let's face the fact that legal system is the thing that need to change and create constitutional change, especially in nascent democracies. So you want to create public buy-in, you want efficiency at the same time, it is acceptable because that's where we have constitutional change on our side. They give us three disparate benefits of politicians or the political system. One, transparency, accessibility, and applicability. Very simply, we believe that this can be imposed on courts as well. Courts are equally transparent as well in their decisions. The Supreme Court justices have to justify their decisions all the time, sometimes even in front of Parliament. So we don't really know that there is any difference in terms of transparency.
If they have to justify themselves and all this accountability that already occurs in Parliament, that UK and PM slows down the system of decision making, wouldn't it then also slow down the decision making?
See, here's the crucial distinction. When you justify yourself in front of Parliament when you are a Supreme Justice, you've often already made the decision and enacted the change. Yes, you have to justify it, but this does not slow it down any further. The distinction is when it comes to filibusters, and when it comes to policies people make, or to have presidential vetoes, which will then require 2/3 of Congress before you can pass that policy again, is what really slows it down and what leaves many of these policies untouched. That's why we believe that the slowness really exists on their side. Second idea, accessibility really is equally accessible on our side. Parliaments are equally guilty of jargon as well. But the core idea that came from second was the idea of turnover rates. That parliaments are uniquely failed in this aspect because they come in with a new term very often, and that means that they don't follow the policies of the previous politicians in power. It means that many of these policies do not see sustainable change. No response from their side means that, we are making this. They only say, but judges can turn over past decisions as well. First, this is less because it is constitutional, the policy-wise, it is a lot more difficult to turn over past decisions. And then they say, but we're admitting ourselves and opening floodgates to regressive policies. Well, this is equally problematic on both sides. If they admit as well that parliaments are able to pass through these policies, they must admit as well that parliaments are able to pass through regressive policies in that fact. If they're willing to admit that people can change and turn conservative overnight. Ultimately, it's our side that stands for both sustainability and the uniqueness in process. We prove public buy-in, we prove efficiency, we stand very firmly in government.
Thank you. To summarize the debate for the op, I'd like to invite the opposition with Gary.
Policy is essentially the most illiberal kind of liberal out there, right? Where that says that here's the right thing you have to believe in. No matter what you actually believe in on the ground, principally that's inconsistent with what they consider is progressively social socially progressive, and it's practically unconvincing to the people as well to say, well, here are some liberal progressive views that we're going to shove down your throat and hopefully you buy it eventually. Three things in this debate. One, what is the right kind of change in society? Two, which side's change is actually more implementable and probably more lasting? Thirdly, which kind of system ensures those things and why Parliament is specifically uniquely advantaged to create that kind of change? What is the right kind of change? Government argues that all court decisions are always good because they're always constitutionally acceptable because they follow some sort of constitutional arbitrary standard. That's just incorrect, right? Procedural interpretation of the Constitution does not automatically mean socially progressive. Hell, if you look at things like abortion rights, that's often freedom of religion versus freedom of bodily autonomy or integrity. They often make a decision that one group of minorities is more important than another group of minorities. It doesn't automatically decide that they're socially progressive. The result often is that minority rights are not protected. In fact, minority rights are often even further denied. That's why examples like Citizens United and Hobby Lobby were important because they denied minority rights for the sake of corporations and worsened the discrimination just as immediately and just as quickly as they wanted on that side. So if speed was important on that side, then they are just as quickly discriminating minorities on that side and we think that was detrimental. The end goal then, is there a clearly self-evident decision that's always more right than another? We told you in opposition, no. There needs to be an actual discussion and an actual deliberation by the people of the country as to what is right and what is wrong. Everything is easier to say is right in retrospect, right? That's why all of the examples about the appetite make no sense. Because from today, we can look at that point and say, well, 60 years ago, appetite was a bad idea. But when you're at that point in time, you cannot make that decision that it was just genuinely right, that appetite was a bad idea. We think that's why time is important. That's why discussion is important. That's why buying is important. And you can't just arbitrarily say that 6 people on the panel or 9 people on the panel decided for everyone in society that this was what was right and everyone else just needed to follow. We didn't understand even from the start why constitutionally acceptable was the bar in this debate. We don't think constitutionally acceptable is a sufficient bar for people to buy in this debate. We don't think that that's something that society needs to follow. The argument from them is well, Parliament is always going to be populist and it's never going to look at what is actually right. The very examples they gave us about tax policies refuted this on their own, right? Tax policies are made by Parliament, not by courts, because Parliament have the best applicable ability to ensure that there's a balance of opinions of people and the needs of society. We think that that kind of environment that the Parliament creates by itself is far better for them than any court can do from an ivory tower of old men who have no clue what they're doing. We think we don't make value judgment on side opposition as to what is regressive or what is progressive. We're happy to say that it takes time because you need to make the right call eventually, and that kind of change needs to be created. Which side's change then is more implementable? We told you at the end of the day that there are 3 things that are required. 1, you need to create a buy-in from the population. 2, you need to ensure that you actually have the enforceability or applicability of the policy. And lastly, we think that transparency and the ability to make the right calls openly were important. Why is the creation of a buy-in something that just doesn't work on their side? Here's the argument from them, that legal precedent automatically means a rally call for the people to fall behind and people will fall in line. That's really idealistic, right? Often it takes generations to create real change on an issue. Their argument was Brown versus Board of Education created some moral change for society to want to accept blacks. Sure, the constitutional change in the country had absolutely no impact on actually creating mindset change on the grounds. Decades later, it was when the first African American politician or leader or CEO was actually nominated. In 2014, Ferguson brutality and second-class treatment of African Americans is still hugely prevalent. No mindset didn't fall behind the fact that Brown versus Board of Education happened. The people on the ground just didn't buy in to the kinds of concepts that legal precedents have set. We think at the end of the day, the buy-in is just not the same as when policies are implemented by individuals who are representatives of what the people actually think. Why? Because the court makes a legal decision based on interpretation of words in a constitution that was written more than a century ago. We think that when you create such policies that are based on interpretations of words on a piece of paper that happened a century ago, the likelihood is that you're divorced from public opinion. That one right opinion in Parliament is going to be one right opinion in a court of law is often going to be divorced from what people on the ground actually believe in. The problem is this: once the legal precedent is set, once the court now says this is the law, this is what's constitutionally acceptable, no other discussion is allowed about it, this is right, then you stop discussing about it. Parliament stops discussing about it. People stop discussing about it. It's assumed that the problem is solved. Debate over. We think that actual change still needs to develop manipulation, and what the court said is not something I agree with. People then start distrusting the system because they believe that these people in their ivory towers have made decisions arbitrarily for them. That's why Muslims nowadays in a lot of these countries choose to go towards informal Sharia courts rather than secular courts. It was arbitrary for them to come up here and say that's because they don't trust the parliament. How is that logical? In a choice between two legal systems, they chose to go to the informal one because they don't trust the formal one any longer, because they don't think that they are going to have the same kinds of value systems that they created for themselves. We think that that's why the system that's created by a legal system to decide this is more liberal, this is more conservative, is a bad kind of ideal because people don't buy into that way and therefore don't trust the legal system anymore. The difference in the parliament is you have a vote to decide who is in that parliament. So if you think that parliament is no longer representative of your own opinions, you vote him out and you put someone else in the next time. We think that's why they have more trust in the parliament system than they do in a legal system where they have no say over who's at the top and they have no say over the opinions that exist on that front. What then do we think about application? We think that knowledge of the needs of the people is something that courts just don't have, right? That's why I say, for instance, the nutrition bill is something that in this court just arbitrarily decided from the ivory tower was some healthy living thing that people needed to have achieved, but was something that they just couldn't enforce on the ground because the people on the ground didn't know what it meant. Even the Ministry of Health didn't know what it meant in terms of enforcement. We think that that's how people in the court of law decide arbitrarily from some random ivory tower as a 90-year-old man that this is legit and this is not. We think that the concept that 90-year-old Scalia has a unique interpretation, as Third Court wanted to call it, was insufficient in telling us that he knew what he wanted and he knew what the people wanted. Transparency on a decision isn't justifiable after it's unable to be overturned. It's not justifiable after it happens, the decision has already been made. We think that people need to be involved in the decision in order for that value to happen, and that only happens when the parliament makes that vote and not a court.
Thank you. To close the debate for the op, I'd like to invite the other side speaker.
I'm going to deal with three things today. Firstly, a key debate block in this debate that was mostly where the crop case resided. Secondly, what is truly effective, which is the heart of the debate with you and where our cases mostly did. And lastly, a note on lasting social change. So firstly, on what I meant by a debate block, what I'm trying to tell you is that the failing of affirmative is to ground as key trust in an undebatable term. What do I mean? They mostly play an emotional trump card to show you the so-called legitimacy of progressive social change. Basically, the poor minorities in life. But that's problematic, right? Because why is the potential life of fetus, for instance, less important than the feelings of a mother? Why is your love for the same gender more important than my love for my church and my God? We asked them questions like this in our POIs, and they agreed that these are very subjective questions and they had no logic to resolve. Why? Because such questions are subjective. That is why they cannot end in anything but a debate block. Because what we have here is a battle of personal and societal convictions. This is precisely the reason why there are only certain moral examples for all about apartheid and slavery. This was like the fact, right, that this reductive law equals everything to this equation. Thus, no justice for the courageous fight for racial equality that mainly happened outside courts. But the point really is that anything is easier to reject, to condemn, to say it's right or wrong in retrospect. After your hearts and minds have been changed, because now the idea of legal enslavement and subhuman status is universally agreed to be messed up, right? There is something that will come to deciding after a long round of discussion, a long round of unfortunate not change. So therefore, this do it because it's right thing that dominated their speeches isn't really debated. Isn't really where the debate lies. The debate really lies in how should we do things regarding social change. That brings me on to my second point. The real debate doesn't lie in what is right, but what is effective. And that's where most of our points lay. Your only engagement here is to tell us that institutions are great in setting trends, or we told you no many points that we have. Decisions can be reversed. The judge is always grounded in reality. The judge can set things back if he or she or they will feel like it. But even assuming that the law holds and everyone understands your long legal verdict, we don't just want legal change, right? A family came out and said, and we agree, that you want lasting social change. The way apartheid is believed by all to be something worth condemning today. That sort of paradigm shift is what we really need. So in other words, what is effective really means what will be believed by people. Something that our cases are very much practiced on. We put in so many things that weren't listened. Recruited politicians will get buy-in because they need people to vote for the next time. Therefore, any stances they take must be supported by the people. Recruited politicians and parliament is more likely to indulge in open, accessible, equitable dialogue and compromise that appeals to both the public and bureaucrats. We worry there's less backlash from conservatives on our side, who will end up thinking on their side that liberals have engineered a system against them. With Poyuan Becker's case, there's less resentment with regards to judges who are now seen as ivory tower people making their own isolated judgments. You also worry that idea of a community is very important in individuals, especially in communal societies. And therefore, you need society to believe that progressive changes are right before you make them. That's why we really think that we are the ones that create belief. We're the ones that truly effectively push for social change. Then we still to my last point, on lasting social change, the metric upon which we have all agreed on. What they come and tell us with, right, is really, you need to get judges to do it because it is right. And also, you need to use a mechanism that lasts. We tell you something different. We tell you the mechanism that lasts doesn't force one conception of the right on the staunchly unconvinced. The mechanism that really lasts at the end of the day, right, is one that peacefully and democratically works to create agreement in our society on what is the right path forward. That is the real way to lasting social change, and therefore I'm extremely proud to oppose.
Thank you. To close the debate, Governor Black, please.
The reason we supported the courts was quite evident. It's all around us right now. The black soldier that serves along his white comrades in the deserts of Afghanistan and Iraq. The 50-year-old Australian who several decades ago was stolen from his family as part of the lost generation, but now finds employment just like any other Australian in Australia. The average woman that can now drive, work, and vote. Because at some point in time, these were the unthinkable. That's exactly what courts can do that parliaments can't. The unthinkable. Let's go back to the 1960s, where modern society encountered a moral quandary and a crossroads. Let's talk about what will happen if we follow opposition, where we saw a perversion of social change, where we saw a case that was extremely ambiguous and reductive. In our first speaker, they told us slow progress was okay even if some women don't get to vote for a couple of years, or some Inuits remain homeless and stateless for a couple more decades. But in our final speaker, in our third speaker, there was absolutely no response whatsoever to the idea of efficiency, of providing rights and protections right now. They created a narrative of weakness, of people that continue to be oppressed by governments only being empowered in the future when paternalistic governments saw pity on them and decided to give them what they wanted. They deterred public buy-in because they reduced transcendental universal human rights to something organized by the whims and fancies of politicians that come and go according to the tide and the ebb and flow in parliaments. They were afraid to contend with our real-world examples of humanity's best and proudest achievements because, I quote their speaker, it was a wash. Clearly, there was a trend across history that courts were the ones that stood by universal rights when people could not. But let's look at the world of the proposition. And here we were proud to stand for immediate social change. We talked about how courts were the ones that were truly perceptive and discerning and could ride on social momentum. Courts that picked up what society truly wanted and aspired towards the future. Courts that had the foresight to look beyond individual needs and individual selfish desires to see a greater conception of their nation. We talked about constitutional acceptability, how we empower disenfranchised minorities, Muslims for example, who are disillusioned by the systems of parliaments now. We expanded their outlook and discourse, bringing in more acceptable ideas for rights for everyone. Let's quote them. They told us that 60 years ago, you didn't know apartheid was wrong anyway. Exactly. But states 60 years ago knew very rightly so that 60 years in the future, apartheid was wrong. That's exactly how we expand discourses and argument they never responded to at all. In fact, we talked about how we created a narrative of solidarity, how oppressed minorities can band together in a powerful symbol of fighting for their own rights in a court and not relying on parliaments who are held accountable to electoral majorities to fight for their very same rights. That's exactly the kind of symbols we need in a nascent democracy. Democracies that are new, democracies that are growing, populations that are finding a personal identity for themselves and their nation. Once again, an argument our final speaker brought up, or heard no response whatsoever. We were proud to stand for a side that engendered sustainable change. We created social movements that people were willing to stand behind and rally in the long run, because we promised them that constitutional courts, whether it's fickle-minded as a parliament or a congress, that constitutional courts and the judicial system in general will establish rules for discourse that could last for millennia. That's exactly why people are more likely to stand by these social movements. So now we live in a world where we can discuss racial, religious, and ethnic equality without fear. I don't know about you, but for that reason alone, I'm pretty glad that we made decisions 50 years ago, in 1960s Jim Crow America, or in 1980s apartheid Johannesburg, made the unthinkable decisions to overturn oppression in the face of overwhelming public opposition. Because of exactly courts that can stand by public oppression and public opposition to make the courageous and the right decisions. For all these reasons, we are very proud to stand outside proposition.
Thanks everyone. Please cross the house, and since it's silent round, you won't be coming back to the room anymore.
Thanks.
Thank you.